They say that drastic times call for drastic measures. At the beginning of the 20th century, the United States was facing a pretty drastic time because we had a major drinking problem. So what's the drastic measure that we came up with to try to combat that? Well, stick around today because that's what we're going to talk about on Mr. E's Classroom. Hey ladies and gentlemen, Mr. E here. That drastic measure the United States came up with? Prohibition. That's the topic of today's video. Prohibition and crime. We're going to try to answer the question, what impact did the 18th Amendment have on America? So grab your pencil and paper and get ready to take some notes. I don't think there are many historians that would argue that by the 1920s, America had a serious drinking problem. In fact, most domestic crime back in the early 1900s could be linked to some sort of alcohol abuse of one form or another. This led progressives, you remember them from the last unit, to really start pushing what was called a temperance movement. Some kind of movement to basically force people to sober up, to stop drinking. This was a movement that was mostly led by women. Well, as this temperance movement of the Progressive era starts to gain some steam, there are two very distinct kind of ideas that start to form. On one hand, you had a group that was known as the Dries. This was a group that really advocated for some sort of legalized Prohibition amendment. They called this idea a very noble experiment. Nowhere else in the world had anybody tried to regulate morality through laws. They argued that this Prohibition amendment would really help to improve individual and family lives. It would create a better society all around. They said, this is just a really good idea. We should really consider it. On the flip side, you had this group known as the Wets. They very much opposed this idea of a Prohibition amendment. They said all it's going to do is create some sort of atmosphere of hypocrisy. Basically, it's just going to lead to a bunch of people breaking the law and causing a whole bunch of crime. They also said that the amendment that was being proposed really doesn't stop people from drinking. It just makes it harder for them to be able to do so. So I've already mentioned the word prohibition a couple of times. What exactly is prohibition? Prohibition is abstaining from consuming alcohol. And this Prohibition amendment that I just got done talking about was the 18th Amendment. It eventually got ratified in 1919. The 18th Amendment banned the manufacture, distribution, and sale of any kind of alcoholic beverages. There's this thing called the Volstead Act that came a little bit later that actually officially enforced this amendment with some rules and regulations and some laws that put prohibition into place. So what actually happens once the 18th Amendment gets passed in 1919? Well, essentially it turns America into a whole bunch of lawbreakers. There's this thing called bootlegging. Bootlegging is basically just making and selling illegal alcohol. Bootlegging becomes the norm. Anybody that has that knowledge and know-how kind of gets into the game to try to make a few extra bucks. Turns out that there's still a whole lot of people that want to get their hands on and drink some alcohol. And essentially Prohibition turns the United States into a nation of criminals. And when I say criminals, I don't mean just seedy kind of underbelly type people. We're talking just about everybody turns into a criminal, even grandma types. One of the more common places to get your hands on some alcohol during Prohibition was at a place called a speakeasy. A speakeasy was just an illegal bar or nightclub that served alcohol. It was usually hidden, most of the time in plain sight. Kind of like this picture right here. If you take a look at this door, there's nothing about this door that says, hey, this is the door to a bar. It just looks like your basic back alley entrance into a building. The term speakeasy basically comes from the idea that you needed to speak easy about these places. You need to kind of be hush-hush about it. You're not supposed to let people know that you know where these places are. But here's the thing. Everyone winds up going to speakeasies. especially if you're an urban dweller. If you live in a city, the speakeasy is kind of the neighborhood place to go hang out. Whether you want to get a drink or not, that's where the people are, so that's where you go to hang out and be seen. And speakeasies came in all sorts of different types. Here's an example of a real basic neighborhood speakeasy that was built up in a tree behind somebody's building. It was out of the way, nobody'd be able to spot you, and as long as you kept quiet, you could sit there and have yourself a drink. A neighborhood pharmacy could easily become a speakeasy. It was the place you went to get some medicine. It was also the place you went to get some special medicine with your buddies. Then you had speakeasies kind of like this place right here, the Cotton Club. The Cotton Club is probably the biggest dance club or music club in Harlem, New York. But if you knew the right words to say, if you knew the right people to ask, you could easily get yourself a drink of wine or champagne at the Cotton Club. The Wets really had it right when they said prohibition would lead to more crime. Not only did it lead kind of common people to turn into criminals, it also really led to the rise of what we would call organized crime. And when we talk prohibition and organized crime, probably the kingpin, the biggest boss of them all is going to be this guy right here, Al Scarface Capone. Undoubtedly one of the biggest organized crime bosses of the day. He worked in and around the Chicago area, but not exclusively. He also had some dealings down in places like Miami and New York and even as far over as Los Angeles. Capone made himself an absolute fortune through dealing in illegal alcohol. It's estimated that in the 1920s he was easily worth about $60 million. And again, that's in the 1920s. It's estimated that at the peak of his kind of dealings in illegal alcohol, Capone was racking in roughly about $100 a minute, 24 hours a day. But here's the thing, Capone never saw himself as a crime boss. He just thought of himself as a business person. Here's a quote from Capone about what he thought about what he was doing. "I make my money from supplying a public demand. If I break the law, my customers, who number in the hundreds of the best people in Chicago, are as guilty as I am. The only difference between us is that I sell and they buy. Everybody calls me a racketeer. I call myself a businessman." And in fact, that's all Capone really thought of himself. He said, "I'm just a businessman. I'm just here trying to make a buck, supplying people with the thing that they want." And here's the thing about dealing in an illegal trade. Sometimes it's really difficult to have business that way because anytime somebody tries to kind of hoard in on your business or kind of cross you in the business world, you don't have many kind of above board ways of dealing like that. You can't really sue another gangster for trying to sell stuff on your turf. Capone got this reputation for being a very ruthless gangster. And to be fair, he really was a ruthless individual. Capone himself never really saw it that way. Here's another Capone quote about kind of how he did business. "Don't mistake my kindness for weakness. I am kind to everyone, but when someone is unkind to me, weak is not what you are going to remember about me." Now here's the thing a lot of people don't realize about Al Capone. Al Capone, to a lot of people, especially in Chicago, was not necessarily viewed as an evil villain. Capone gave away a whole lot of that money that he made to try to make Chicago a better place. And because of that, he kind of got a little bit of a reputation for being a softy. Other gangsters saw this as an opportunity to maybe kind of exploit and make themselves some more money. So when they tried to cross Capone, Capone basically smacked them right back twice as hard. And this is where that idea of being a ruthless gangster comes from. If you were dealing with Capone in a non-mobster, non-gangster kind of situation, he was a really nice guy. He'd give you the shirt off his back. He was a very friendly, very personable type of person. But when it came to business, if you cost him any kind of money, he would not stand for it. Prohibition actually caused a huge divide in the United States. A lot of rural Americans started to link alcohol with criminal behavior, especially some of this crime that was happening in the big cities that was making it into the papers. Think mobsters, Al Capone, stuff like that. Urbanites, on the other hand, people living in the cities, they really just saw Prohibition as kind of a nuisance. It was Prohibition that actually caused the criminal behavior. If Prohibition wasn't around, then a lot of the crime that was happening wouldn't be happening because it wouldn't be against the law. And they really pushed to have a repeal of that 18th Amendment. Now, it took some time. Eventually, the 21st Amendment comes around and actually reverses Prohibition and makes it legal for alcohol to be produced and sold and transported and all that other stuff that the 18th Amendment kind of banned. What should you take away from this video? Number one, remember that in the early 20th century, America had a serious drinking problem. Number two, the 18th Amendment was meant to try to fix America's drinking problem. Last but not least, number three, remember that Prohibition basically turned the U.S. into a nation of criminals. And there you go, guys. Prohibition and crime. Hopefully you got some great notes. Be ready for the quiz when it happens in class. As always, till next time, remember, don't stop learning.